It was just before supper when the church doors shut behind her, and not a single soul turned back to help her up. Letty Harlan stood in the middle of Barlow's main street with one slipper lost somewhere between the parsonage and the dust, a bruise blooming purple across her temple like spilled ink. The child in her arms, a soft, whimpering bundle no bigger than a sack of flour, breathed shallowly against her collarbone. Wind scraped the dirt across her bare ankle, as if to finish what the town had started. She blinked into the sun's last light, dazed and dizzy, and the hush that followed her departure from the church settled heavy as judgment. Two women peered from the mercantile window and whispered. Hands over their hearts like grief was something you could pin like a brooch. Their husbands had been the ones to drag Letty out by the arms, quietly, sternly, with eyes that never met hers. The sheriff stood by, arms crossed, a look on his face like a man too tired to interfere with what folks called justice. Justice in Barlow didn't come with a gavel. It came with silence, with cold bread, with doors that no longer opened when you knocked. Letty's knees wobbled. The baby stirred, then coughed. A dry little sound. She pressed her cracked lips to the child's scalp and whispered a prayer, not because she thought heaven was listening, but because speaking aloud kept her upright. She made it 4 steps toward the inn before the owner stepped out and nailed a closed sign to the door. For more to the baker's, where a pie cooled in the window. But the curtain snapped shut before her shadow reached the sill. The baby's name was Junie, short for Juneberry, born in a rented back room with nothing but a midwife and a thunderstorm for company. She had Ezra's gray eyes, but Ezra had never wanted to see them. He was the preacher's son. She'd worn white, and when the swelling came before it should have, the whispers grew teeth. Letty remembered the slap his mother gave her. Not a word, just a flat, unforgiving palm to the cheek, like she was a tarnished relic that needed breaking before discarding. That morning, they'd made it official, escorted her out like a bad tenant. Not a soul stood up for her. Even God, it seemed, had looked away. By sundown, she'd left town proper and found herself near the old rail depot, abandoned but still sturdy. The rusted roof jutted out just enough to shield her and the baby from the biting wind. She lowered herself onto a crate, cradling Junie close. Her shoulder throbbed from the shove she'd taken outside the church. Her dress was torn beneath the waist, blood and milk mingling in the cloth. She should have been crying, she thought. It would have made sense. But the tears just wouldn't come. Instead, she sat still as stone, breathing in the damp scent of old wood and coal dust, trying not to shiver too hard. Junie fussed, squirmed, then let out a piercing cry that echoed down the tracks like a train that would never come. "Sho, little peach." "Mama's here," she whispered. Still here. Somewhere above her, on the ridge beyond the station, a lone rider reined in his horse. He'd been watching since she stumbled down the hillside, a tall man in a dark coat, beard brushed silver by age and grit, eyes shadowed beneath a wide hat. He didn't move to approach, didn't speak her name. He just watched as the last of her pride bled into the dirt, and when the baby cried again, his hand tightened on the reins like he recognized the sound. Ezra Thorne wasn't known for charity. Folks in town whispered about him too, that he'd struck gold somewhere east and come back different. Built his ranch alone, buried a wife in silence, paid cash for everything, and never lingered long enough for conversation. But he noticed things. And what he saw now, a mother curled like a dying leaf around her child, lips pale, eyes empty, unsettled something deep in him. Still, he didn't descend the hill. Not yet. Night rolled in with a sharp wind and a wolf's distant cry. Letty rocked Junie against her chest and tucked the child beneath what was left of her shawl. She pulled her knees to her chin, arms shaking from exhaustion. Her lips moved in silent repetition, names, memories, things she needed to hold onto before sleep took them away. A door opened somewhere in the dark. She blinked. No, not a door, a dream, perhaps. She must be dreaming. But when she blinked again, there was a flicker of gold in the dirt at her feet, a silk handkerchief, white as cream and folded with care, and tucked inside a silver coin. No note, no boot prints, no shadow, just that. She didn't touch it for a long while. Couldn't. Then, with trembling fingers, she drew it close and held it to her chest like it might warm her. Junie stirred again. Letty pressed a kiss to her forehead, let the silver glint in the moonlight, and finally, let a single tear fall. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, he returned. Ezra rode up quiet, dismounted slow. He didn't call out, didn't offer explanation. Just set a basket down beside the station wall. Inside were strips of jerky, a flask of hot coffee, a woolen blanket folded neat, and a small bar of lye soap. Letty blinked sleep from her eyes, her mouth parting, unsure whether to speak, to scream, to thank him. But Ezra simply tipped his hat, looked at the baby, then at her, and walked back to his horse. She almost asked why, almost begged to know what for. But something in his gaze told her that answers weren't the currency he dealt in. Not yet. She bathed Junie that afternoon with melted snow water and soap that smelled faintly of sage. She took tiny bites of the jerky, careful to ration, careful to savor. When the baby fell asleep, Letty watched the horizon. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't touched her. But something in her chest felt less hollow now. She stayed another night under the rail depot. The wind still cut sharp, but it no longer felt cruel, only cold. She wrapped Junie in the blanket, curled herself around her, and whispered stories into the dark. Not fairy tales, not scripture, just memories of honeysuckle summers and her mother's voice singing lullabies that didn't belong to shame. The third morning, he came again. This time, he didn't bring a basket. He brought a wagon. He stood beside it, arms folded, gaze level. "There's a cabin on the edge of my land," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Empty. It's yours if you want it." Letty opened her mouth, closed it. He didn't repeat himself. Junie gurgled softly from the folds of the blanket. Letty looked down at her daughter's face, so small, so warm, so blameless, and nodded. She stood with quiet effort, every limb stiff and aching. Ezra didn't reach to help, didn't offer pity, just stepped aside and waited. She climbed into the wagon without a word. As the wheels turned and the town fell behind, Letty looked back only once, toward the church, the windows, the painted sign. Not a single curtain stirred. She turned forward again. Junie slept against her breast, breath warm and even. The wind brushed her hair gently, as if to say, "This, too, will pass." Ezra drove without looking at her, but his jaw tightened when she shivered, and he handed her his coat without speaking. She took it, wrapped it around herself and the baby, and for the first time in days, she exhaled without pain. The road to Ezra Thorne's ranch curved like a question mark through the winter-blanched hills. No fences, just scrubland, wind, and the sound of hooves muffled in dust. Letty sat stiff on the wagon bench, the baby nestled close under Ezra's coat, her spine straight not from pride but from the fear of softening too soon. Ezra hadn't spoken since offering the cabin. Not when she climbed in, not when she handed him back the coin, not even when Junie coughed in her sleep, and Letty instinctively adjusted the coat to cover her ears. His silence wasn't cold, it was deliberate, measured like a man who had learned the value of saying nothing. His eyes were always ahead. His hands, calloused and steady, moved with the confidence of someone who rarely explained himself. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had begun its slow descent. The sky turned the color of old peaches and bruised lilac. The cabin itself sat tucked beside a shallow creek, hidden in a small grove of pinyon and juniper. It wasn't much, single-room, low-roofed, with a stone hearth and one shutter hanging off its hinge, but it stood. And for Letty, that was more shelter than she'd dared to imagine. Ezra halted the wagon, stepped down, and opened the door for her. She hesitated, not out of distrust, but reverence. Stepping into a space not stained by memory felt too good, too foreign. "The well's out back," Ezra said finally, nodding to the path. "Woodpiles covered. You'll need to bank the fire at night. Coyotes come close sometimes, but they don't bother much." Letty met his gaze for the first time since they left town. His eyes were not soft, but neither were they hard, just weathered. Like he'd seen too many things to flinch now. "Thank you," she murmured. He gave a slow nod and turned to unload the supplies from the wagon. Flour, beans, coffee, a pot, a kettle, some coarse cloth diapers, and, most surprising of all, a cradle, carved from cedar and smoothed with years of wear. That was hers. Letty asked softly, brushing her fingers over its edge. Ezra paused. A long time ago. The meaning hung between them like the scent of sage after rain. He didn't offer more, and she didn't ask. Inside, the air was dry and faintly smoky from an old chimney draft, but it carried none of the mildew and shame she'd breathed in town. The hearth's ashes were cold, but Ezra built a fire without instruction, stacking kindling like a ritual. He showed her how the latch stuck on the door, how the window opened if you propped it just right with a spoon. Then he set the coffee tin down on the shelf, adjusted the stovepipe, and stepped back like a man who knew when to leave. Letty stood by the hearth, baby in her arms, the firelight flickering along the cut of her cheek. Junie had begun to fuss again, small lips rooting against her shoulder. She shifted to nurse her, careful, modest. Ezra averted his eyes and headed for the door. "I'll come by tomorrow. Check the roof," he said without turning. She opened her mouth to reply, but he was already gone, his coat vanishing into the dusk. The next morning, before the sun had fully climbed the ridge, she woke to the sound of hooves. Through the open shutter, she saw him riding out to the far field, trailing cattle behind him like they were dogs who trusted his rhythm. The image stayed with her, how he moved through space like a man who never took more than he needed. For the first 3 days, Ezra didn't say more than a few words. He brought firewood, left it by the door, left flour and salt, dried apples, and once, to her disbelief, a small jar of honey. He didn't ask questions, didn't linger. But she noticed things. He always removed his hat before stepping near. He never looked too long at the cradle, even when Junie slept in it. He made sure she had enough to manage, but never so much she'd feel indebted. On the 4th day, she asked if she could help muck the barn. His brow lifted, surprised, maybe, by her voice. "You don't have to." "I know. But I want to earn what I'm using." He considered that, then nodded once. "There's an extra pair of boots by the shed. They're worn, but dry." That afternoon, Letty stood ankle-deep in straw and manure, her skirts tied at the knees, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her arms ached. Her back groaned. But when Ezra handed her a tin mug of water, there was a quiet gleam in his eye, like she'd passed some unspoken test. She began helping with the chickens next. Then, with brushing down the horses. Junie stayed swaddled nearby in a basket of blankets and wool, eyes wide and curious, cheeks flushed with cold. Letty talked to her constantly, little murmured phrases, bits of songs her mother used to hum. Ezra would pause in his work sometimes and listen, not intruding, just bearing witness. Once he returned from the market in town with 2 things, a bolt of blue calico and a tin rattle carved with the shape of a bird. He didn't hand them to her, just left them on the porch. She found them after supper, touched them like they might disappear. He never asked how she'd gotten her bruises, never spoke her name in judgment. But one evening, as they sat near the barn, watching the sky burn down in golds and rust, she said, "They thought I'd lie down and take it." Ezra didn't turn his head. "They thought I'd disappear." Junie gurgled softly on her lap. Letty traced circles on her back. "I tried to fight. But when nobody else stands with you, you stop knowing which parts of you are worth saving." The silence that followed was not empty. It was sacred, like the air between 2 songs. Ezra's voice, when it came, was low. "Sometimes it's not about standing up. Sometimes it's just about still being here." She looked at him, then really looked. The lines in his face told a story. Not one he'd speak, but one she could feel in the way he set things down gently. The way he never touched her without need. The way he watched Junie, like she was proof something good could come back from the ashes. The gossip reached them sooner than she expected. It came in the form of a merchant refusing her service when she rode into town for lie. A woman muttering shameless under her breath as Letty passed. A note tacked to the church door that read, "Sinners don't change. They just find quiet places to rot." Ezra found it first, tore it down before she could see. But the way his jaw locked told her enough. "I don't care what they say," she murmured, back at the cabin. feeding Junie beside the fire. "You should," he said. "You're raising someone who'll have to live in the world they poison." She looked up. "Then teach me how not to run." That night, Ezra brought her a second chair for the porch, set it beside hers without comment. The next evening, he brought a third, for Junie, though she couldn't sit on her own just yet. She smiled for the first time in what felt like years. They sat in the dusk, all three of them, the fireflies blinking against the dark, a soft breeze tugging at the cottonwood leaves. Letty turned her face toward the stars. Ezra turned toward her. And though no words passed between them, something shifted. A thread pulled taut between two people who'd lost much, but hadn't lost the will to rebuild. By the third week, Letty had learned the rhythm of Ezra Thorne's ranch. How the wind curled low in the morning. How the roosters called not at dawn, but just before it. How the horses leaned against the rails when they wanted company, but never begged for it. It was a place where silence spoke plainly and work was worship. And Letty, for the first time since being cast out, had begun to hum. She did it quietly, under her breath, when folding laundry on the line or ladling stew into Ezra's bowl. Just soft tunes from childhood, melodies with no words, only memory. Junie had grown used to the hush of the land and now slept longer through the nights. Her cheeks had plumped. Her cries came less from hunger and more from impatience. Letty no longer flinched at every knock of wood or shout from the field. Her bruises had faded. Her eyes had not. But peace, like spring, never settled long in a town like Barlow. The first sign was the coldness at the general store. Letty had gone into town alone, bundled in Ezra's second-best coat, Junie strapped to her chest. She needed thread and cornmeal. The shopkeeper, who used to nod kindly when she came with Ezra, looked past her as though she were a ghost. The coins she laid on the counter sat untouched for too long. "Folk vie been a skin," he said finally, folding the cloth slowly. "If that's your husband." She didn't flinch. "No." He sniffed, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "Ought to be, way you live out there." She said nothing more, took her things, and left. By the time she returned to the ranch, her back ached from carrying Junie, and her mind ached from the stairs. She didn't tell Ezra. There was no point in dragging shadows where light had begun to gather. But a few days later, a boy, no more than 12, rode up on a jittery mare and tossed a bundle at her feet. It was the blue calico dress Ezra had bought, torn down the side, smeared with what looked like hog blood. A note pinned crudely to the front read, "No matter how you scrub a barn rat, it stays a rat." Ezra found her kneeling in the dirt beside it, fists clenched, mouth shut tight. She didn't cry. She simply folded the fabric carefully and stood. He burned it in the fire that night without comment. The next day, he rode into town and returned with a bolt of red gingham and a box of sewing needles. She said thank you. He just nodded. But the rumors didn't stop. They multiplied like flies in summer. Some said she was his mistress. Others whispered she bewitched him. A few suggested Junie wasn't even his or hers, that she'd stolen the baby from someone back east. The words crept in through cracks. Letty found herself watching his expression more often, waiting for signs that the burden of her reputation had grown too heavy to carry. He gave none. Instead, Ezra began rising earlier, working longer. His mouth stayed firm, his eyes harder. When the sheriff stopped by one morning, Boothiel's loud on the porch, Letty knew it had come to a head. "Just here as a courtesy, Ezra," Sheriff Brandt said, tipping his hat more out of habit than respect. "Town's worried. They're a skin if she sets in up, a kind of arrangement out here." Ezra didn't answer right away. He stood by the gate, one hand on the latch, his other holding a pail of feed. Letty watched from the cabin doorway, Junie asleep in her arms. "You come to arrest me?" Ezra asked. Brandt shifted. No, just advisin'. You keepin' her and that child under your roof. Folks'll think things." Ezra looked up then, slow and deliberate. "They already think what they want. Hasn't stopped you from buying my beef." Brandt gave a tight smile. "Town's not wrong, though. Women like her." The pail dropped with a clang. Ezra stepped forward. "You say another word about her, I'll forget you wear that tin star." Brant paled, mouth half open. Ezra never raised his voice. Never needed to. She's working. She's raising her child. She's done more honest living in 3 weeks than most of this town in a year, Ezra said, voice low but deadly clear. The sheriff mounted up without another word. Afterward, Ezra didn't speak of it. But Letty saw his hand tremble when he lit the evening fire. That night, she sat beside him on the porch and asked, "Why do you keep standing up for me?" He stared out into the dark, jaw clenched. Because no one stood up for her. She knew then, not just from the words, but the weight of them. There had been a wife. A child, maybe. Loss so old it had turned to bone. He'd never spoken of it, but it lived in every quiet kindness he showed. Letty reached over, touched the back of his hand. Just for a moment. He didn't move it away. Days passed. The ranch moved with the wind. Fences to mend, troughs to fill, laundry to scrub. Letty sewed dresses from the gingham, let Junie gum soft cornbread, planted rosemary in a little pot by the window. Ezra kept bringing her things, nails, a lantern, an old book of poems, without a cover. Then came the Sunday service. She hadn't planned to go, but she woke early, bathed Junie in warm water, and pulled on her cleanest dress. Ezra looked up from his coffee, one brow raised. "I need to be seen," she said simply. "I won't live hiding." He didn't argue, just handed her the reins. When she arrived, the church quieted. Her steps on the wood echoed louder than the hymns. The pews were full. No one shifted to make room, so she stood in back, holding Junie tight. The sermon was about forgiveness. The preacher didn't look her way once. After, on the steps, Mrs. Fenwick approached. A widow in gray, with lips thin as sewing thread. "You think showing your face here makes you pious?" she hissed. "You're a stain." Letty didn't flinch. "I'm a mother. You're a disgrace. And he's a fool." Letty's voice came soft. "Say what you will about me, but leave my daughter out of it." Mrs. Fenwick raised a hand like she might slap her. But Ezra's voice came like thunder from behind. "Try it." Mrs. Fenwick froze, lips pressed in. He stood at the foot of the steps, arms folded. The entire church turned. "No one here's clean," he said. "So unless you'd like your sins aired out with hers, I'd keep your mouth shut." Gasps, murmurs. Mrs. Fenwick retreated. Letty walked past them all, Junie asleep on her chest, head held high. Ezra fell in beside her, without a word. That night, she sat with him on the porch again. Junie rocked in the cradle nearby. "I never wanted to come back," she admitted. "Not after what they did. But you made it bearable." He didn't answer, but he didn't look away. The air between them changed, quiet but sure. And in that silence, something fragile grew stronger, like a fire banked through wind. The storm came in quiet. No fanfare, no thunder. Just a lowering of the sky, like a frown deepening. The wind turned sharp as a bone saw, and the trees along Ezra's ridge began to lean, as though trying to whisper something urgent. By midday, the air smelled of copper and far-off lightning. But the real storm had already begun, days before, when someone carved the word whore into the bark of the cottonwood outside Letty's cabin. Ezra had found it first. Said nothing. He stood there a long time, gloved hands clenched, his back too still. Then he fetched his axe and cut the tree down without a word. Not for fuel, not to burn, just to erase it from the land. But rumors, like roots, don't die that easy. They curl deep and wait for fire. That night, the wind howled across the valley like a warning. Letty banked the hearth and tucked Junie into the cradle. Ezra hadn't come for supper, which meant he was still in the barn, checking latches, calming the horses. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, the door creaking like a sigh. Lightning flashed on the ridge, then again closer. Her first thought was, he should come in before the rain hits. Her second was, why is the barn glowing? A low, angry light pulsed against the dark like a second dawn. Then she smelled it, oil and smoke, acrid and fast, and her heart seized. The barn was on fire. She ran barefoot, shouting his name before her voice caught in her throat. The wind flung sparks sideways. The horses screamed inside. Flames licked through the loft like tongues of hate. And then she saw him Ezra, stumbling out with a halter in one hand, blood on his temple. She caught him just before he fell. "Three still inside," he gasped. "Backstall." She looked toward the door. Fire surged like a beast. She looked back at him. His hand tightened on hers. "Don't. I have to. Letty, you saved me. You gave us a place to stand. I won't let it all burn." Before he could protest, she pressed his hand to her chest and ran. The heat hit like a slap, thick and immediate. Smoke clawed her lungs. She ducked low, weaving through flame and debris, following the sound of panicked hooves. She found the mare first, Star, with wild eyes and foam-flecked lips. She unlatched the gate, slapped her flank, and the mare bolted out into the night. The others followed instinct or maybe hope. She barely got out before the loft collapsed behind her, a roar of fire swallowing everything. She stumbled into the open air, coughing, throat raw. Ezra was on his knees in the mud, watching the barn die. She dropped beside him, sobbing through soot. "I got them," she whispered. "They're safe." He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Then the wind shifted, and she saw something glint in the dirt just beside the fence line. A ring, plain gold, scuffed. She picked it up. Ezra's eyes narrowed. "That's the deacon's." "From the church?" He nodded once. They didn't speak again that night. Ezra's wounds weren't deep, but they were messy. She cleaned the gash on his temple with boiled water and torn linen. He sat quietly, shirt off, eyes on the fire. Junie, still unbothered, slept beside them. Outside, the barn smoldered. The storm passed. In the morning, Letty saddled Ezra's second horse, braided her hair tight, dressed in the gingham he'd bought her. She pinned the gold ring to the collar. Ezra stood at the gate, watching. "You don't have to." "I do," she said. "For her. For me. For you." He stepped forward, hands hesitant. Then he brushed a curl from her cheek. "Don't let them twist your voice." "I won't." She rode into town alone. The dust hadn't settled from the night storm. People were gathered on the church steps, talking low. The smell of wet ashes still lingered in the air. She dismounted, walked past them all, up the steps. No one spoke. Inside, the church was dim, the windows stained with sun. The preacher stood mid-sermon, pausing when he saw her. Behind him sat the deacon, gray-bearded, eyes hard. Letty didn't wait for permission. She walked straight to the pulpit, unpinned the ring, and held it up. "This was found outside a burning barn," she said, voice clear. "A barn on Ezra Thorne's land. A fire that could have killed him. That nearly killed me. That was meant to punish, not for sin, but for survival." Murmurs rose like insects. "Some of you stood by when I was cast out. Some helped push. You said I was ruined, used filthy. You said I was shame. But I raised my daughter from scraps. I cleaned blood from my own clothes. I held my baby when no one else would touch her. And that man, the one you gossip about, the one you mock, he gave us bread and shelter. Without asking who I was, without asking what I'd done. He saw I was drowning and didn't ask how I fell." The preacher stepped forward. "This isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," she said louder. "You preached forgiveness last Sunday, but you couldn't spare it for a mother and a child. You closed your doors. You let them hurt me." She turned to the congregation. "I am not afraid of your silence anymore." Then she set the ring on the pulpit and walked out. It was only when she reached the bottom of the steps that she realized others had followed. First, the seamstress. Then, the laundress. Then a woman she'd never met, one who walked with a limp and tears down her face. They formed a line behind her. No one spoke, but they stood. Ezra's wagon appeared at the edge of the square. He stepped down and walked to her, hands open. The deacon burst from the church doors, red-faced. "This is madness. She's nothing." Ezra's voice cut through the square. "You speak again. I'll show the sheriff what we found." The deacon blanched. The preacher didn't intervene. His hands just trembled. Letty climbed onto the wagon beside Ezra. Junie cooed from the basket between them. They rode home without speaking, but the silence was different now. It held things. Later that week, Ezra sold a portion of his land to a carpenter, had him build a second cabin beside Letty's, then a third. He called it the Harlan home, for women, for mothers, for those who'd been left behind. Letty became its heart. She taught letters, tended to cuts, held crying hands. Ezra built swings from cottonwood and planted lilac by the porch. He never asked for thanks. He just fixed fences and held Junie when she reached for him. One night, under the stars, Letty sat beside him. "She'll never know what we came from," she said. Ezra looked at the child sleeping on his chest. "She doesn't have to." Letty laid her head on his shoulder. His arm curled around her without thinking. The wind stirred the grass. And somewhere in town, a new mother whispered a lullaby Letty had once sung in a burned-out rail station. We all think strength looks like thunder, like fists and shouting. But sometimes it's a woman walking back into the place that broke her, standing tall, and saying no more. Sometimes it's a man who listens. And sometimes it's the child they carry between them, unbowed, untouched, who proves that grace was always louder than gossip.